Karen, our HOA president, delivered the final blow one chilly Tuesday morning. I found the notice taped to my front door in neon orange, another fine, this time for non-regulation landscaping, whatever that meant. The fines had stacked up, $50 for my mailbox being the wrong color, $100 because my dog's leash wasn't neutral enough, and now, $500 for my rose bushes not matching the aesthetic. I almost laughed, until I flipped over the letter. Failure to comply will result in legal action. HOA intends to file suit. That's when I knew Karen had gone too far. She thought I was just some quiet, average guy. She didn't know my best friend from college was the state attorney. She didn't know he owed me his career. And she definitely didn't know that when I fight smart. The letter wasn't a threat to me. It was an invitation to war. And Karen was about to learn the difference between petty power and real power. I moved into Willow Bend in early spring, thinking I'd finally found the kind of peace I'd been chasing for years. After the divorce, after the long battles over things that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did, I was ready to breathe again. Willow Bend promised that. The online listing had described it as a tranquil neighborhood with tree-lined streets and community charm. It sounded like exactly what I needed. And when I first drove through the gates and saw the neat houses, the trimmed hedges, and the rows of cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom, I thought, for a moment, that I'd found my quiet place. The house itself was a little worn around the edges. A craftsman-style two-story with a wraparound porch that reminded me of the home I'd grown up in. The front yard was overgrown, but I saw potential. Something about it called to me. I made an offer that afternoon. 2 weeks later, I had the keys in my hand. I spent the first days fixing it up, nothing major, mowing the lawn, pulling weeds, cleaning out the gutters. Simple things. Things that gave my hands something to do, while my head worked through the things I was trying not to think about. It felt good. The HOA introduced themselves on my second morning there. A cheerful pamphlet tucked into my mailbox, printed in soft pastels with a photo of smiling neighbors on the front. Welcome to the Willow Bend community, it said. The packet included a list of community events, a spring potluck, a 4th of July parade, and a thin booklet titled Rules and Regulations. I remember sitting on the porch that evening with a beer, flipping through it and thinking, okay, this isn't so bad. Keep your lawn tidy, no loud music after 9 p.m. Don't paint your house neon green, all reasonable enough. I didn't meet anyone in person right away, but that wasn't surprising. People keep to themselves at first. And truthfully, I didn't mind. I wasn't looking to make friends. I just wanted a place where I could sit on my porch in the mornings, drink my coffee, and listen to the birds. And for a little while, that's exactly what I had. But peace, I would soon learn, doesn't last long in Willow Bend. Not with an HOA like ours, not with Karen. It happened exactly 23 days after I moved in. I remember because I was finally starting to feel like the place was mine. The lawn was trimmed, the flower beds mulched, and I'd even hung an old wind chime from the porch that my mom had given me years ago. The mornings were quiet, just the way I liked them. Coffee in hand, Then came the knock. It was sharp and deliberate, not the kind of knock a neighbor gives when they're dropping off a welcome pie. I opened the door to find a woman standing there, arms crossed over a pristine binder, a polite but distant smile on her face, blonde bob, flawless makeup, a red blazer that screamed authority. Karen. Good morning, she said sweetly, though her eyes didn't smile. I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Willow Bend Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally deliver this. She held out a pale yellow envelope, the kind that usually meant trouble. I took it, glancing at the words, violation notice, stamped across the front in bold, unfriendly letters. I'm sure it's just a little oversight, she continued. But your mailbox doesn't conform to our community standards. They should be painted community beige, as per page 12 of the HOA guidelines. I looked past her at my mailbox. A deep forest green, the same color it had been when I bought the house. I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. It's not a big deal, Karen assured me, tucking the binder under her arm. We like to handle these things informally when we can. Just repaint it, and no fines will be necessary. Her tone made it sound like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful. I'll take care of it, I said. She smiled. Wonderful. We're all about keeping Willow Bend beautiful. I repainted the mailbox that afternoon, went to the hardware store, bought the exact shade of beige from the HOA-approved swatch, and covered every inch of green. As I worked, I told myself it was nothing. Just paint. No reason to make waves. I wanted peace. But later that night, sitting on my porch, staring at the beige mailbox in the fading light, I realized I'd given Karen something she wanted: compliance. And that was a mistake. It didn't take long for Karen's game to shift from polite suggestions to outright control. After the mailbox incident, I thought I'd bought myself a little peace. But peace, as I came to learn, wasn't what Karen offered. Compliance was just her opening move. A week after I repainted the mailbox, I found another notice wedged under my front door. Unauthorized flora. That's what it said. Apparently, the potted plants on my porch weren't HOA approved. They were Boston ferns, common, quiet things that my mother always kept. But Karen's letter informed me that only native, drought-tolerant species were permitted in front-facing areas. She even included a list of approved shrubs and ground cover, as if she were doing me a favor. I moved the ferns to the backyard. I didn't want to deal with it. 2 days later, another notice arrived, this time about the length of my grass. 3.5 inches. That's what she claimed. I don't know if she measured it herself, but the letter insisted the HOA standard was 3 inches or less. I mowed it the same day, even though I'd already cut it that week. That was the pattern. Small things, petty things. She kept me just busy enough with her notices and warnings that I never had time to settle in, to feel like the house was really mine. And when I looked up from my work, I'd catch her watching, always watching, sometimes from her driveway across the street, sometimes from her morning power walks. She'd stop and snap photos of my yard like I was a crime scene. At first I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then I started noticing the same thing happening to others. The Thompsons, 2 houses down, suddenly replaced their mailbox overnight. Mrs. Lee, who had a pair of wind chimes on her porch, took them down after Karen left a bright orange slip on her door. People whispered, but no one pushed back. Karen didn't yell or threaten. She smiled, handed out notices, and called it preserving property values. And no one dared question her authority. Except, eventually, I would. But not yet. For now, I was still playing her game, still convincing myself I just wanted peace. It was a Tuesday when I found it. The envelope duct taped to my front door, not slid neatly into the mailbox, not tucked politely under the mat, taped there, as if to make sure I couldn't miss it. Bold black letters screamed, "Certified Delivery." Across the front, along with my full name in sharp block handwriting. I stood there for a long minute, staring at it like it might explode if I touched it. When I finally peeled it off and opened it, I found what Karen likely thought was her masterstroke. A cease and desist letter from the Willow Bend Homeowners Association, 5 neatly typed pages on HOA letterhead, complete with her signature in elegant blue ink at the bottom. According to Karen and her so-called legal team, I was in chronic violation of HOA standards. I skimmed the list. Unauthorized porch decor. That meant the 2 lanterns I'd hung from the rafters last month. Excessive porch decorations, she wrote, as if my home was a carnival attraction. Then came unregistered dog breed. That one stopped me cold. I stared at the words for a full 10 seconds before I laughed. My dog, Baxter, was a 6-year-old golden retriever, registered, vaccinated, microchipped. But Karen's letter insisted his breed wasn't on the HOA's approved list for common areas, as if Baxter ever left the yard. Then came the dollar amount. Total fines outstanding, $5,000. Payment due within 14 days to avoid legal action, including but not limited to property liens and further penalties. I read that part twice, slow. Karen was threatening to slap a lien on my house over a made-up debt, and if I didn't pay, she was going to sue me. The absurdity of it was almost funny. Almost. But as I stood there on my porch, the letter trembling just a little in my hand, it hit me. This wasn't about fines or mailbox colors or grass height. It wasn't even about me. Karen needed control. She needed people to fall in line. And when they didn't, she turned the screws until they did. I was supposed to be afraid, to pay up, repaint, replant, and roll over. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its envelope. Then I went inside, poured a drink, and stared out the window for a long while. Karen had just declared war. What she didn't realize was that I'd already decided to fight back, and I never started a fight I didn't plan to finish. The notice came on a Thursday evening, a folded flyer shoved into my mailbox, printed in bold red letters. Emergency HOA meeting, attendance mandatory. It was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the community center. No explanation. Just a time, a place, and an unspoken warning. I knew what it was about before I even finished reading. When I arrived, the room was already half full. The usual suspects sat in tight rows of plastic chairs. Longtime residents, wary newcomers, and Karen's inner circle perched up front. She stood by the podium in her signature red blazer, flipping through papers like she was preparing for trial. She probably thought she was. I took a seat in the back. Some of the neighbors glanced at me and quickly looked away. Others gave me tight, apologetic smiles before turning back to their phones or fiddling with the edges of their agendas. No one said a word. Karen tapped her sparkly gavel on the podium. "Let's come to order," she announced, her voice bright but cold. "This meeting has been called to address serious concerns regarding one of our community members and his ongoing violations of HOA guidelines." She didn't say my name at first. She didn't have to. Every eye shifted toward me. She clicked the remote in her hand, and the projector screen behind her blinked to life. The first slide was a photo of my house from the street. Then a close-up of my porch lanterns. Then another of Baxter, my dog, lying in the grass like he was public enemy number one. Karen paced slowly in front of the images, like a prosecutor laying out her case. "These violations are not isolated incidents," she said. "They represent a pattern of disregard for our community standards, excessive decorations," the slide changed, "unauthorized plant species," another click, and of course, the repeated failure to comply with our guidelines regarding pet registration. She let the last photo linger. It was me, standing in my driveway, holding the cease and desist letter. She'd zoomed in just enough to capture the exhaustion in my face. "Our property values depend on uniformity and respect for rules," Karen went on. "One person's neglect affects us all." Some heads nodded. A few people shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke up. I sat there, silent, hands resting on my knees, and watched her turn the room against me. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. Because I knew something Karen didn't. She was giving me everything I needed, and when I was done, she wouldn't have a podium to stand behind anymore. The house was quiet that night. Too quiet. Even Baxter seemed to sense something was off, lying at my feet with his head on his paws, watching me like he expected me to do something. I sat on the porch with a whiskey in one hand, and that stack of violation notices in the other. 10 of them. Neatly stacked, perfectly aligned, like they'd been designed to suffocate me one sheet of paper at a time. The last one, the cease and desist, was on top, its language cold and clinical. Karen's signature was flawless, a looping flourish like she was proud of herself. I stared at it for a long while, running my thumb along the edge of the paper. She thought she had me boxed in. She thought I'd break. I didn't break. I reached for my phone instead. David answered on the third ring. "Didn't expect to hear from you this late," he said. His voice was the same as it had been in law school, calm, steady, like a man who always knew where the exits were. "I need a favor," I said. "You're not the favor-asking type." "Yeah, well, Karen Mitchell's giving me a reason." I could hear him sit up, papers rustling in the background. HOA trouble? Worse than that. I told him everything, from the mailbox to the porch plants to the fines. I told him about the cease and desist, about the meeting today, the photos, the public shaming. I laid it out the way he always told me to in law school, clean, factual, with no emotion to cloud the details. But there was something burning underneath every word. David was quiet for a moment, then he let out a breath. "She picked the wrong guy?" "Yeah," I said. "I thought if I just played along it would stop." "It never stops," he said. "Send me everything, the notices, any emails, photos, if you've got them." "I've got plenty," I said. "Good," he replied, "because it's time to clean house." And just like that, something inside me settled. Not because I thought it would be easy, but because I knew I wasn't in this alone anymore. I hung up the phone, reached down to scratch Baxter behind the ears, and looked out over the street. Karen's porch light was still on across the road. She was probably sitting there, feeling smug, thinking she'd won. I let her have it, for now. The next few days were a blur of scanning, filing, and documenting. Every notice Karen had ever left on my door, every certified letter she'd sent, every photo I'd taken of her standing at the edge of my property with her tape measure in hand, I gathered it all into neat little digital folders. David's instructions had been clear. The more we have, the faster we move. It wasn't hard. Karen had been sloppy, too confident in her own power, too used to people rolling over at the first sign of pressure. I found inconsistencies in the notices almost immediately, dates that didn't line up, infractions that contradicted earlier approvals. I even found 2 different versions of the HOA handbook, one from when I moved in and another edited version with extra rules Karen had slipped in 6 months later without informing anyone. David's team pulled the HOA financials. Public records are public for a reason, and David had the right people asking the right questions. It didn't take them long to find where the money was going. Thousands in fines collected but never logged. Payments made to a landscaping company that showed up on nearly every HOA balance sheet. Mitchell Outdoor Solutions. David called me one night, his voice sharp. Guess who owns Mitchell Outdoor Solutions? I already knew before he said it. Karen's cousin. Bingo, David said. And that same company is charging 3 times the rate for basic maintenance. Half the time, they're billing for services they never performed. It was fraud, simple, classic, and it was right there in black and white. But Karen had gotten away with it for so long because no one had ever stood up to her. No one had pulled back the curtain. Until now. I kept gathering. Every photo I had of Karen standing on someone else's property, every whispered story from neighbors too afraid to speak in public. I wrote it all down, documented everything, and as the case file grew thicker, something in me shifted. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. Karen had done this to everyone in Willow Bend, the Thompsons, Mrs. Lee, the quiet old man who'd stopped putting up his flag after Karen fined him for the pole being improperly anchored. This wasn't just about a mailbox. It was about making sure Karen never did this to anyone again. The envelope came 2 days after David's team uncovered the fraud. Another certified letter slid neatly into my mailbox this time, like Karen was trying to play by the rules for once. It was on thick, expensive paper, an attempt at intimidation, I figured, and stamped with an official-looking logo I didn't recognize. The letterhead read, Law Offices of Thomas Ridley and Associates. I sat at the kitchen table, Baxter at my feet, and read the first paragraph aloud. Cease and desist. Demand for immediate remediation. Pending civil litigation. I stopped and shook my head. She's really leaning into this. The letter was long. Too long. 5 pages of legal jargon strung together like a threat wrapped in red tape. Words like damages, breach of covenant, and malicious non-compliance jumped out at me, along with an impressively inflated figure, $25,000. That was what Karen was now demanding, apparently for the emotional distress and reputational harm I'd caused her. I didn't know whether to laugh or be impressed by the audacity. Instead, I called David. He answered on the first ring. You get something new? Yeah, I said, holding the letter up like he could see it through the phone. She's got a lawyer now, Thomas Ridley. Forward it to me, he said without hesitation. I scanned the pages, attached them to an email, and hit send. 10 minutes later, David called back. He was laughing. Thomas Ridley doesn't exist, he said. At least, not as a lawyer. Hat? He's a paralegal, not licensed to practice law in this state. Or any state, as far as I can tell. He used to work at a real estate law firm a few towns over, but got fired 2 years ago. For what? Unauthorized legal representation. Sound familiar? I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. Karen hired a paralegal to pose as an attorney? Looks like it. I'm filing a complaint with the state bar today, and I'm forwarding everything to the licensing board. I let out a slow breath. She's desperate. She's sloppy, David corrected, which makes my job easier. I sat back in my chair and watched Baxter snore softly at my feet. There was something satisfying about knowing Karen's latest move had already failed before she even played the card. She really thought this guy could scare me, I said. She doesn't understand who she's dealing with, David replied, but she's about to. Word traveled fast in Willow Bend. By the end of the week, everyone seemed to know Karen was suing me. Some pretended they hadn't heard, but the way they avoided my eye at the mailbox or crossed to the other side of the street told me otherwise. Karen made sure of it. She strutted around the neighborhood on her morning inspection walks, stopping just long enough to chat with anyone who'd listen. "He'll be out by Christmas," I overheard her telling Mr. Jensen, our elderly neighbor, who spent most days on his porch. "It's unfortunate, really, but we have rules for a reason." At the Saturday HOA meeting, she brought copies of the lawsuit and passed them out like they were coupons for a bake sale, glossy folders with printed summaries that made me sound like the neighborhood menace. She highlighted phrases like non-compliant, community disruption, and legal eviction pending. I watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing. She carried on like a queen holding court, soaking up every worried glance and hushed whisper. Her favorite line was, "We're just protecting property values." She said it at least 3 times during that meeting, as if saying it enough would make it true. I saw Mrs. Lee sitting 2 rows ahead of me, staring down at her lap the whole time. The Thompsons didn't even show up. They'd given up a long time ago. By now, Karen had convinced half the neighborhood I was on my way out, that I'd brought it on myself by refusing to follow the rules. I caught sight of her standing outside the community center afterward, smiling, shaking hands with people like she was running for office. They acted like they didn't see me as I walked past. But I wasn't interested in what they thought. Not yet. David's voice echoed in my head. "Wait. Be patient. Let her think she's winning." So I kept my head down, mowed my lawn, walked Baxter twice a day like always. I waved at neighbors even when they didn't wave back. Karen's house, directly across the street from mine, lit up every evening. I could see her in the front window sometimes, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing sharply. She was busy preparing for a battle she thought she'd already won. I didn't bother correcting her. Every night, I sent more files to David. Every morning, his team sent updates. We had enough evidence to burn her entire little kingdom down. But we weren't ready to light the match. Not yet. Let her hand out her lawsuits and spread her rumors. Let her gloat. Because when the time came, it wasn't just going to be a lawsuit. It was going to be an execution. Absolutely. From here on out, I'll keep the paragraphs continuous. No extra spaces between them unless you specify otherwise. Here's Chapter 10, again, with that in mind. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when David made the move that changed everything. He filed the formal complaint with the State Housing Authority, backed by a thick stack of documents we'd gathered over the last few weeks: fraud, embezzlement, discriminatory enforcement, misuse of HOA funds. It was all there, clean, clear, and impossible to ignore. The kind of case file that didn't sit on someone's desk for long. By Friday, they'd assigned investigators. Not just one, but a team. According to David, they took one look at our evidence and decided this wasn't a case they could handle over the phone. It was bigger than anyone expected, more corrupt, dirtier. The first letter went out to Karen that same day. An official notice from the Housing Authority, certified mail, with demands for access to the HOA's full financial records, meeting minutes, and bylaws. It was formal, cold. It was the kind of letter that usually made people sweat. An early warning, really. A chance for Karen to come clean, or at least act like she cared about the rules for once. She didn't even flinch. 2 days later, I watched her from my porch. Karen strolled out to her mailbox in her usual red blazer and heels, pulled out the letter like she was picking up a catalog, and barely glanced at the seal before she tucked it under her arm. She smirked. She had the same look she always did when she thought she was winning. Later that afternoon, she called another emergency HOA meeting, said it was about community clarity. Really, it was just damage control. She stood at the front of the room with her back straight, her voice calm, holding the Housing Authority's letter like it was nothing more than an invitation to a bake sale. "There's nothing to worry about," she told them. "This is routine. We've been through this before." That was a lie, but it was a lie most of the room wanted to believe. They nodded along as Karen assured them the HOA's finances were in perfect order, that the fines and fees were all within their rights, and that the state was just doing its job. I sat there in the back of the room and watched her spin it. She really thought she could talk her way out of this. She thought the housing authority would be just another committee she could charm, the way she charmed her loyal followers on the board. But this wasn't Willow Bend's playground, and she wasn't dealing with frightened neighbors anymore. What Karen didn't realize was that the investigators were already pulling her records. They were already talking to former board members, already reviewing years of paper trails that David's team had made impossible to ignore. She thought she was untouchable. She had no idea how close the walls were closing in. I kept my days simple in the weeks leading up to the court date. Mowed the lawn every Saturday, same time as always. Walked Baxter twice a day, down the same quiet streets where people used to wave before all this started. I still waved, even when most of them didn't wave back. It was easier that way, cleaner. David had told me to stay predictable, keep my head down. Let Karen think she still had the upper hand. But I could feel the shift, subtle at first. The glances from neighbors lasted a little longer now. They were watching me, but not with the same suspicion. Some days, someone would pass close enough to murmur a few words under their breath. "It's about time," they said, or, "We're glad someone's doing something." Sometimes just a nod. Never more than that, not yet. Karen watched me closer than anyone. I saw her across the street almost every morning, coffee cup in one hand, phone in the other, pretending to scroll through emails, but always keeping me in her line of sight. Her little inspection walks got longer, slower. Sometimes she'd stop in front of my house and just stand there for a few minutes, as if daring me to say something. I didn't. I didn't give her the satisfaction. The cease and desist letter still hung over everything, but I kept a file on my desk, thicker than a law textbook. Karen didn't know what was in it. David did, and he said we were ready. The court date had been set for 3 weeks out, long enough for Karen to get comfortable, to feel untouchable. But every day that passed, the case against her got tighter. The housing authority wasn't sitting idle. They were quietly building their own file, piece by piece, talking to every neighbor Karen had ever wronged. I didn't tell anyone what we had. Not yet. Let Karen keep handing out her lawsuits like candy. Let her neighbors squirm under her rules a little while longer. This was the quiet before the storm, and I was just fine with that. On the outside, I looked like I was waiting. But inside, I was ready. The court date was coming, and Karen was about to find out exactly who she'd been messing with. Karen strutted into the courtroom like it was just another HOA meeting she was running. Same red blazer, same sharp heels clicking across the polished floor, and that same tight-lipped smile she wore when she thought she was winning. She carried a leather binder under one arm, stuffed full of paperwork I already knew was meaningless. Pages of photos, notices, and fines she thought would prove her case. She looked around the room like she expected applause. I stayed back by the door, letting her have her moment. David walked in beside me, calm as ever, his briefcase in one hand, the other tucked casually into his pocket, like we were here to talk about the weather. The judge looked up when we entered, eyes skimming over Karen first, then settling on David with something close to recognition. David gave a small nod, not smug, just steady. It was the kind of nod that said, "This is under control." Karen's expression flickered when she saw him, just for a second. Then she lifted her chin higher and moved toward her table. She sat, carefully arranging her binder, smoothing out her papers. She kept glancing at the door like she was waiting for someone. Her fake lawyer never came. He wasn't going to. David had made sure of that. The paralegal who had been pretending to represent her had been disbarred, or more accurately, banned from ever pretending to be a lawyer again. Less than 24 hours before. The state bar had moved fast once David filed the complaint. Karen was on her own now. The bailiff called us forward. We stood side by side while the judge reviewed the docket. Karen took a breath like she was about to launch into one of her usual speeches, the ones she gave at HOA meetings where no one dared to question her. But this wasn't the community center, and the judge didn't care about Karen's self-importance. David spoke first. He introduced himself formally, outlined his role as my legal representation, and handed over a thick packet of documents. "We're prepared to present evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and willful misrepresentation," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "as well as a countersuit regarding harassment and defamation." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She flipped open her binder like it could shield her. The judge flipped through David's documents for a long, silent moment. Then he looked over his glasses and said, "Mrs. Mitchell, do you have legal counsel today?" Karen hesitated. My attorney couldn't be here." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Or he was disbarred." And just like that, the game changed. David was a different man when he stood in front of a courtroom. Back when we were in law school, I saw glimpses of it. The way his voice could cut through noise. The way he could control a room without raising his tone. But here, under the cold fluorescence of the county courthouse, he was all precision, calm, measured, relentless. He started with the basics. "Your Honor," he said, handing the judge the first exhibit, "this is the HOA charter for Willow Bend. You'll notice the bylaws explicitly require a board vote for any new fines or community standards." He let the judge take his time. Yet, under Mrs. Mitchell's leadership, that process was sidestepped. David moved on to meeting minutes, 2 different versions from the same month, one that had been filed properly, and another doctored copy that Karen had distributed to justify her sudden increase in fines. The judge compared them side by side. Even from where I sat, I could see the moment his face hardened. "Now," David said, with all the ease of a man giving a lecture on an already settled matter, "we have bank records from Mitchell Outdoor Solutions, Mrs. Mitchell's cousin's company." He flipped through them slowly, giving the room time to absorb each page. Payments from HOA funds made regularly for services either grossly overpriced or, in several cases, not performed at all. We've already provided sworn affidavits from 2 previous board members confirming they never authorized these contracts. Karen's hands were clenched so tightly around her pen I thought it might snap. Her face had gone pale, that bright red lipstick suddenly garish against skin drained of color. She glanced around, looking for an exit that wasn't there. David wasn't finished. "We also have documentation of fines levied disproportionately against certain residents, specifically those who challenged Mrs. Mitchell in previous HOA elections." He gestured toward the stack of violations I'd received, along with affidavits from several other neighbors who'd been targeted in the same way. Karen made a sound then, something between a cough and a protest. She started to stand, one trembling hand raised like she was still running a meeting at the community center. The judge didn't even look at her. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said flatly, "you'll have your turn. Sit down." She froze, then sank back into her chair, the illusion of control slipping from her grasp with every passing second. David returned to his notes, unbothered, ready to move on to the next point. It was a performance, sure, but it wasn't just for show. He was delivering the facts like a surgeon with a scalpel, and Karen, she was already bleeding. The courtroom was silent when the judge finally closed the file in front of him and leaned back in his chair. He gave Karen a long, steady look. I could almost hear her holding her breath, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. David stood beside me, still and calm, like he already knew what was about to happen. "This court finds in favor of the defendant," the judge said, his voice steady and final. "The plaintiff's claims are without merit. Mrs. Mitchell's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice." Karen made a faint choking sound. For a second, I thought she might faint right there at her little table, but she didn't. She stayed upright, even as her hands trembled against the edges of her binder. The judge wasn't finished. He reached for another document, stamped, and signed. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court orders a full independent audit of the Willow Bend Homeowners Association's financial records. The State Housing Authority has been notified. Investigators are already in possession of preliminary evidence suggesting fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of funds." Karen's face drained of what little color it had left. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The judge looked past her toward the back of the courtroom. "You'll find state investigators waiting outside to speak with you, Mrs. Mitchell. I suggest you cooperate fully." For a moment, she just sat there, frozen. Like if she stayed perfectly still, she could make herself invisible. But then reality caught up with her. She gathered her papers with stiff, jerky movements, shoving them into her bag without the neat precision she usually prided herself on. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at David. She kept her head down, but it wasn't shame that bent her shoulders. It was defeat. As she stepped through the courtroom doors, the flash of cameras lit up the hallway. Word had already spread. Reporters were there, waiting with their microphones and pointed questions. Karen kept her chin up, trying to look composed, but it was too late. The story was out. Her little empire, the one she'd built on fear, manipulation, and control, was crumbling. David closed his briefcase with a quiet snap. He glanced at me, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Told you," he said, and for the first time in months, I let myself believe it was over. At least, for now. Karen lasted 6 more days after the verdict. 6 days of pretending nothing had changed, still marching down the sidewalks with her clipboard in hand, still pausing at the edges of lawns to scrutinize mailbox heights and hedge lines. But there was something hollow about her now, something cracked and fragile that hadn't been there before. She still smiled, but it was tight, brittle. Everyone could see it, and everyone knew it was over. The resignation letter arrived quietly, no announcement, no grand farewell. Just a folded piece of paper slid under the doors of every house on the block. Effective immediately, Karen Mitchell has resigned from her position as president of the Willow Bend HOA. There was no apology, not even a polite thank you, just that one line, followed by an abrupt signature at the bottom. I found mine early on a Tuesday morning. It was tucked under my welcome mat, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to face me, even indirectly. I stood there on the porch for a long minute, holding the letter in my hand. Baxter sat beside me, tail thumping once against the boards, like even he could sense the shift. It was quiet that day, quieter than it had been in a long time. The moving trucks showed up the following Friday, 2 of them, bright white with big logos on the side. I watched from the porch as men in uniforms loaded box after box into the back. Karen stood by the open door of her house, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching them work. She was dressed casually for once. No red blazer, no heels. She didn't look around, didn't wave to anyone, and no one came by to say goodbye. The neighborhood stayed still. Blinds cracked just enough for people to peek out. Lawnmowers that usually buzzed on a Friday afternoon stayed silent. Even the wind felt softer somehow, like it was giving her space to leave in peace, or maybe just waiting for her to be gone. When the last box was loaded and the door of the second truck slammed shut, Karen finally climbed into her SUV. It was spotless, like it always had been. She backed out of the driveway slowly, not even glancing in the rearview mirror. No one stood outside. No one waved, no casseroles or well wishes. Just silence. I watched the SUV roll down the street, turn the corner, and disappear. And just like that, Karen was gone. The first thing we did after Karen left was call a meeting, a real one. No emergency summons, no threats attached. Just a simple invitation slipped into everyone's mailbox, inviting them to the community center on a sunny Saturday afternoon. No agenda, no speeches, just a promise to listen. I wasn't sure how many people would show. After everything Karen had put them through, I wouldn't have blamed them for staying home. But by the time I walked in, the room was full. People who hadn't spoken to one another in months sat shoulder to shoulder. Some of them smiled at me when I took my seat near the front. Others gave me small nods, quiet but grateful. We held new elections that day, simple and honest. No backroom deals, no pre-written ballots. Just a chance for people to stand up and say why they wanted to help. I ran, not because I wanted a title or a nameplate, but because I figured someone had to make sure it was done right this time. Someone who wasn't interested in power. The vote was unanimous, not just for me, but for the whole board. 5 people who just wanted to make the neighborhood feel like a neighborhood again. The first thing we did was rewrite the bylaws. We got rid of the arbitrary rules, the ones Karen had slipped in without anyone's consent. No more fines for things like porch decorations or grass height. No more approved mailbox colors, and definitely no more penalties for dog leash colors or wind chimes. We brought in an independent mediator to help, someone who'd never lived in Willow Bend, who didn't know any of us. It kept things honest, fair. It was slow going at first. Years of fear had made everyone cautious, but little by little, people started coming back. They asked questions, shared ideas, and after a while, they started smiling again. I saw Mrs. Lee plant new flowers in her front yard, bright and wild and beautiful. The Thompsons put their wind chimes back up. Mr. Jensen raised his flag again. Small things, but they meant something. The next time I walked Baxter down the street, people waved. Some stopped to talk. I hadn't realized how much I missed it. The sound of neighbors laughing together in their front yards. We weren't just fixing bylaws. We were rebuilding trust, rebuilding what Karen had broken. And, for the first time in a long time, Willow Bend felt like home again. It was one of those quiet evenings that made moving to Willow Bend worth it. The sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the rooftops, and a warm breeze stirred the wind chimes I'd finally put back up. Baxter lay at my feet, his breathing slow and steady, his head resting against the worn wood of the porch. For the first time in a long time, the world felt still, peaceful. My phone buzzed on the table next to me. I picked it up without much thought, already knowing who it was. David didn't call often, but when he did, it usually meant something had shifted. His name flashed across the screen, and I answered on the first ring. "She took the deal," he said, wasting no time. I sat back in my chair, watching the last light fade behind the trees. Yeah? Yeah. Pleaded out to fraud and mismanagement. She's barred from holding any position on an HOA board. Ever. I let out a slow breath, a small laugh escaping before I could stop it. She'll hate that more than the fines. David chuckled on the other end. That's why I pushed for it. I didn't say anything for a while, just listened to the breeze, the quiet creak of the swing beneath me, and Baxter's steady breathing. It should have felt like a victory. Maybe it was. But in the back of my mind, I knew better. "There'll be another one," I said finally. "There always is," David agreed. "But they'll think twice before picking you." I smiled at that. Not a big smile, but something real. "Next time, they won't get the chance." David's tone softened. "You did good. The neighborhood's better for it." "Yeah," I said. "It is." We hung up, and I set the phone down, closing my eyes for a second as the last rays of sunlight faded. Across the street, where Karen's house used to stand, a new family was moving in. A young couple. They'd put out flower pots on the porch already, bright red geraniums. The kind Karen would have fined them for. I watched them for a while, thinking how easy it would be to forget what had happened here. How tempting it was to believe things like this couldn't happen again. But I knew better. There's always another Karen, someone who needs control more than they need peace. But next time, I'll be ready.